My name is Michael Greenstone, and I'm the director of the Institute for Climate and Sustainable Growth. And we're incredibly excited about this event tonight. Oftentimes, these events require lots of fine-tuning and planning. And this all started with the kernel of an idea. Oh, Hina Khar is visiting us. And then the next thing, there was this incredible rock star panel, all built around Hina's visit. So we're very excited about that. So let me just say welcome, thank you for joining us. The U.S. has historically played an important role in international climate conversations over the past few decades, building consensus and designing many of the key mechanisms of global climate agreements. I would say probably the U.S.'s role going forward is a little less clear than it was. And so that raises a whole series of fascinating questions. Why the change? What kind of void does this create? Will any one country or group of countries try to step in to the role that the U.S. had previously held? How does this affect the U.S.'s role more broadly, not just in climate space? And I think regardless of the role the U.S. plays, the climate is still changing. Its impacts are felt more and more every year. And it means that the conversation we're going to have tonight is not just an academic conversation, but it's one that influences people's lives and people's well-being. And so that's why we're incredibly excited to have this discussion. We have George David Banks, who was a climate advisor to President Trump during the first Trump term, as well as senior advisor on international affairs and climate change for former President George W. Bush. David has focused his career on climate change, energy, and trade, including most recently as Executive Vice President of the American Council on Capital Formation. Our second panelist is Sue Biniaz. Sue was the lead U.S. climate lawyer for more than 25 years and the Principal Deputy Special Envoy for Climate under President Biden. She has played a central role in all international climate negotiations, including the Paris Agreement, and her list of accomplishments goes on and on, but all of those are secondary in our mind here to her time as a former EPIC fellow. I think you taught a class at the law school, Sue, is that right? Yes, and the law school faculty still talk about that class all the time, and when can we get Sue back? Hina Rabbani Khar is a former foreign minister of Pakistan and currently serves as chair of the Pakistan Parliament's Foreign Relations Committee. Hina also serves I think it's no longer active, the Climate Overshoot Commission, served on the Climate Overshoot Commission, an international group of leaders focused on reducing the risk of exceeding the Paris Agreement's warming thresholds. I'm incredibly thrilled to welcome Hina here, who, as I said, set off this terrific event. She's also going to be joining as a distinguished fellow, and Sue is returning as a distinguished fellow, I should have mentioned that. And finally, our host or moderator today also has long ties with the University of Chicago. Amy Harder was the first EPIC Journalism Fellow. We're constantly trying to get Amy to continue to engage with us in one way or another. And she's one of the country's top national energy and climate change reporters, having led energy policy coverage for the National Journal, the Wall Street Journal, and Axios. Then she was recruited away from that by Breakthrough Energy to launch the independent news outlet Cipher, where she now serves as executive editor. So I want to welcome Hina, Sue, David, and Amy. Maybe all of you can join me in giving them an opening round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back? Great. Well, Michael, thank you for that great introduction. I really could not have handpicked a better panel than the folks we have here on stage today, so I'm thrilled to be up here as well. This is such an important topic, and yet one that might be getting a tad overlooked with everything else that's happened in the, say, last 100 days of our lives. So clearly there's a lot of interest. The amount of people that signed up, I think, was, far exceeded the capacity of this room, so it's great to see such interest. So I want to get to it. To kind of set the stage, I want to open with a lightning round question. And Dave, we're going to start with you. You are all in.
The Republican.
The Republican. I'm not going to do a raise of hands for other Republicans, but raise your hand if you were a Republican and you worked in the Trump administration. You are all in one way or the other expert at words and the power that words can have. So what's one word that pops into your mind to describe climate diplomacy in the last 100 days? Okay? Just one word.
For climate diplomacy. Just for
How would you describe it in the last 100 days?
for
Climate change, yeah.
Trump 2.0.
Yeah, under Trump.
Non-existent.
What was that? I love the audience participation. Others we love that. We encourage it. Hina, I'll go to you.
Just the Trump administration?
What's one word to describe your thoughts on the last 100 days of climate under Trump?
Dangerous.
Sue?
Are we just talking about the United States or the world? The
I
US?
see.
I have the same question.
You guys ask too many questions. That's my job. The whole world.
I guess for the whole world, I would say unclear. For the US, I'd probably say annihilation.
Okay, so we got annihilation, unclear, dangerous, non-existent, and clueless. So if you did a word cloud, that would be an interesting thing for somebody to find in 50 years. So Sue, I want to come back to you. You just left the US government for a second time after Trump won. Can you give us a sense of what kinds of conversations are you having about this moment in time with fellow climate diplomats? Can you kind of peel back the curtain for us?
Yeah, it's a good question. Obviously, everybody is focused on many, many things, including COP30, which Brazil is hosting. But I think the two things that they most want to talk to me about involve the U.S. and then a question that I think was raised a bit earlier, which is like who steps in for the United States. So on the first one, they're very interested in whether the United States will continue to participate. Under Trump 1, thanks to Dave Banks, the United States was still able to engage constructively in the development of the rules under the Paris Agreement while the announcement was being made that we were going to pull out of the Paris Agreement. This time it doesn't look like it's going to be that way. So far the U.S. climate team has not been able to engage at all and go to any meetings. Now, one thing people around the world have been kind of debating, wanting to talk about, is whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. I think they mostly are coming out on the side of maybe it's better that they don't participate because their positions are likely to be, so unconstructive that maybe it's better that there's no participation. But in terms of the United States, the other issue they ask or want to know, do I have any insight into, is whether the United States this time is going to be actively pushing other countries to follow suit. Last time they didn't really. They announced they were pulling out of the Paris Agreement, but didn't sort of push others to withdraw. Nobody else did. They didn't really push other countries to redo their nationally determined contributions, their emissions targets. This time I think it's an open question whether they will do that, and that's something people are kind of keenly interested in. The second issue is maybe this leadership challenge issue, and the question whether, the Biden administration was very out there in terms of leading. The president did a virtual summit within the first 100 days. They got John Kerry in. That raised the kind of the level and stature of other countries, special envoys, etc. We made climate a top issue for foreign policy and national security, etc. And now the question is who steps in? I mean, Europe's having its own issues with security, kind of more of a top priority, obviously, than climate. For China, there's an issue whether they will step up. It's one thing to talk about multilateralism, which President Xi did last week at the UN Secretary General's summit, but it's quite another thing to act like a leader, and time will tell whether their emissions target, which they're supposed to submit later this year, will actually be a, kind of leadership-like target. So those are the kinds of conversations that I've at least been having.
That's great, and we're gonna dive into a lot of what you just talked about more deeply in a moment. Dave, I wanna turn to you. It sounds like maybe you might have some difference of opinions with the current Trump administration, and we'll get to that. But could you take us, from your perspective, can you give us a better understanding of what's going on inside the administration? What are they thinking about climate change this time around? Can you take us inside their brains?
Okay, so it's very different, obviously, from I think the worldview that many of us have, or folks who work on climate have. First of all, with the president, I think it's important to note that he clearly is a climate skeptic, no question about it. He's very public about it, but he hasn't been an ideologue on the issue. And this is where, Sue, when you say annihilation, doesn't really quite square with where he actually is, right? So that tells you something, right? So I think for President Trump, he's traditionally looked at climate as, well, or through the lens of what does this do to the competitiveness of U.S. manufacturing. This goes back to the days of Kyoto. So there's still some of that sort of Kyoto hangover that affects U.S. Or Republican policymakers on climate. But that's really where the president is. The president, we had a lively debate on the Paris Agreement in the first months of 2017, and he went back and forth whether to stay or whether to leave. And at the end, he decided to leave because he didn't know how to communicate that to his base. So that's a very different sort of outcome, conclusion, than, say, annihilation. Now, what I think has happened over time, and by the way, one quick point, kind of looking at the differences, is that at the time, even though
The difference between last Trump administration.
yes, and so if you're looking at sort of the first few years or so, keep in mind that the president said in his Rose Garden speech, which totally got lost, he didn't actually withdraw from the Paris Agreement then, right? He had to wait for it to be effective or enforcement for 3 years. And then he left the door open. He's like, if I can get a better deal, I'll stay. So it was still out there that maybe the president changed his mind, and that's why we worked at the COP to advance the rule book and to make sure that the Paris Agreement was as good of an agreement as we could get, just in case the president decided to stay in. Well, there was no real follow-up work when some of us were removed from the White House, right? And so, at that point, it was just a kind of a baseline decision to oppose the Paris Agreement. And that's just kind of what stuck. So moving into the second term, there was no debate whatsoever related to Paris, right? So that was the baseline decision. But what was really surprising, I think, was this annihilation aspect of where the administration aggressively has taken the sledgehammer. You all have seen this. So all the climate programming, the messaging, taking out references to climate on the websites and being forbidden to talk about climate in meetings with the administration. It's really, really bizarre. And including with the presidential personnel sort of recruitment process, where they're not letting people into work maybe I'm the reason for that, but they're not letting people into the administration who believe that climate's a problem, right?
How do you know that? Did you?
First-hand experience. So the trade team wanted me to come in and work on trade policy, and I went through the whole process, and then PPO, presidential personnel, said no because of the climate work. So I think it's just very telling, right? So it's a very sort of focused process, right? To essentially essentially, I don't want to say declare war, they've already declared war, but annihilate all this sort of the climate agenda. Now, where are they coming from? That's really the question here, right? And I think that when it comes to climate policy in general, they see that as it's the Green New Deal. It's a policy that's designed to promote sort of left-wing socialist policies. It's a policy designed to deindustrialize the United States, to undermine U.S. economic and energy security. That's where they are. May disagree with that, but that's where they are. And so they're looking at something like the COP, the Paris Agreement, or the UNFCCC, the Paris Agreement, and they're asking themselves, why are we in this agreement when it's so anti-U.S. economic and energy interests, right? And so I think that that's just the way they see things. And so where I would disagree is, like, if you've got a problem with the current international climate agenda, you should engage and try to change that agenda to something that fits or is better aligned with sort of your own goals and objectives.
Yeah, and we're going to unpack a lot of that in a moment. But Hina, I want to turn to you. What kinds of conversations have you been having with other leaders around the world? And to what extent is climate diplomacy being sidelined for other, sometimes more pressing issues? I mean, I think some of us have probably seen headlines about the geopolitical unrest happening in Pakistan and India right now. How has climate factored into your conversations, and how does it compare to these other issues?
Okay, so just sitting here and listening to Sue and David just makes you realize as to we live in the same world, but we're almost denying the fact that we have a common good called the atmosphere, and that we all share. That the win-win in this is so when we say we can our ability to negotiate a better deal, I question that because I think here the deal is either works for everyone or it doesn't work for anyone. So if you look at the case of India and Pakistan, for instance, we share the glaciers, we share the waters, okay, and the world is going in a direction where a celebrated gold standard of lower riparian, upper riparian water treaty has now been held in abeyance by Indians not because the treaty allows them to be held in abeyance, because they think they can get away with it. So the strong will do what they can and the weak will suffer what they must. So that's what the world that we're living through, what is going through. And everything else that is happening is almost like a reflection or just a result or a product of that. Because it's the unraveling of the world order with nothing to replace it. So the conversations that, when you say what are the conversations you're having, I think the conversations are so different depending on who you're having the conversation with. And that never used to be the case, okay? So the developing world, for instance, came out of COP29 thinking, oh God, we got $300 billion in terms of NCQG. But now the wording is so different. It is no more the responsibility of the developed world. We already thought we had lost so much from Kyoto to Paris Agreement, and now the responsibility is shared completely. And here we have, the view of the US that this is not a deal which is good enough for them, right? So it's really, to me, it's almost like being a denier of the reality that is staring us in the face, that we can either save everyone or no one will be saved. And I keep on repeating this is a reality check that needs to be taken in. It's already there. I mean, why in a country like Pakistan, it's not like we are more wise or more educated or the literacy rate is better. It's just that we have seen and experienced the wrath of climate change in all its enormity. And your GDP per capita is not going to save you. Your high rises are not going to save you. It's not a matter of when, if, it's a matter of when for everyone. So I worry about, and you asked the question, diplomacy. I don't think we have, there is no diplomacy increasingly. And as someone who was told that no matter what the level of conflict in your area, no matter how much bigger, belligerent a neighbor, you must never spend on military spending, etc. And you see a trend towards 2% GDP to be celebrated and 5% to be really accolades being given. It's a really, really different world. But I do want to say one thing clearly and articulate it to the best of language at my disposal. There is no one filling the gap that the United States of America is giving. And there are good reasons for that and bad reasons for that. The United States of America maybe is a global leader, is the superpower. Yes, you're scared, very scared, exceptionally scared, unnecessarily scared in my view of emerging powers, emerging countries. In my view, unnecessarily threatened, unnecessarily scared. However, be what it may. The exceptionalism that in some ways the United States of America enjoys gives it the power to both inspire and to give a lot of pain. Okay, I've never been in favor of the things that have unraveled, the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, what they've left behind. No more in your news, but we are still experiencing that because we live in that geography where those wars will happen. Now, the ability of the US to both inspire and to give pain is an exceptional ability which was used for the better of the world in the form of being able to negotiate the common good on climate change in Paris Climate Agreement, right? And as somebody who comes from the developing world, I cannot tell you and I cannot name another multilateral agreement which has been as effective in going down to the root and to the bottom of every developing country's agenda. It's been completely internalized. It's part of your development agenda. It's part of your environment agenda. It's there. And to now walk away from that and to leave the world figuring out, guessing America is back again or great again, and when will it be great again, when will it be back again? You know, nations are defined good, solid, powerful, I believe. Nations are defined by two elements which are more important than anything else, which is credibility and predictability. I would argue that the United States of America, for reasons unbeknownst to people like me, because I think you have you have come to universities like this and you are inspired in ways and means that no one else can probably replicate. So one doesn't, I don't have good answers as to what are the reasons for that, but that I just know this much from my 20 years of diplomacy, that space on being the arbitrator for common goods is not going to be filled by anyone else because nobody does diplomacy the way the United States does with its ability to both give pain and both to inspire.
That's such an important question, and it's actually my next one about the void of U.S. leadership. So we got Hina's perspective that it's possibly going to be an empty void. Sue, can you weigh in on that from your perspective? And I'll add in sort of the obvious filler of that void, which is China. What are the implications of that?
Yeah, well, let me first say, maybe, in response to something that Hina said, when we were developing the Paris Agreement, we really thought it would address the issues that Republicans had with previous agreements, and I just think that's a really important point. When the Senate adopted its resolution 95-0 in the middle of the Kyoto Protocol negotiations, they basically said, don't bring us an agreement that will either harm the US economy or that contains kind of binding targets for the United States if it doesn't also include such targets for developing countries. Didn't say they had to be the same ones, but they had to be in the same time period. Well, we really took that to heart. I worked for all the different administrations, and I know that every one, including the Democratic ones, kind of took those principles to heart. And when we started developing the Paris Agreement, we were very focused on creating a system that would include developing countries, not with the exact same targets, but everybody would have to be in, particularly the major developing countries whose emissions were rising. Otherwise, you wouldn't have an agreement that was environmentally worthy or politically defensible. And we tried to make sure that any US target would not harm the US economy. And we thought that the Paris Agreement design did exactly those things. First of all, everybody was in. Everybody would design their own target. And that meant not only that the Obama administration could put in its target, but it meant that if a future Republican administration came along, and we didn't know it would be so soon, they could change the target. We specifically said a party can change the target kind of midstream. And so we really thought we, in good faith, had developed something that would work for the ages. And so it was very disappointing to find that it did not work, and not really for very good reasons. When President Trump did make that Rose Garden announcement that Dave referred to, he did not give an explanation that made sense. It sounded like he was talking about the Kyoto Protocol when he criticized the Paris Agreement. So I am at a point where I don't think there is any form of international agreement that would satisfy the Paris Agreement critics, because what else could you possibly do? It was all there. So that was a very long way of saying I basically, I guess I'm, agreeing with Hina that it was kind of indefensible to walk away from that, on top of the fact that you're leaving all these countries in the lurch after you got them all to internalize the, kind of features of the Paris Agreement. In terms of like who takes the place.
I wanna pause there and
yeah.
we'll come back to that question, but Dave, I wanna turn to you and get your response to what Sue just said. It seems like the goalposts have moved, right, up within the Republican Party. Can you talk about why you think that happened? And
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And so, I agree with everything that Sue said. And I remind people that at the end of the Bush administration, Sue and I were working together then, that was the goal. The Paris Agreement was what we were looking to do, right? Now, what happened, and I don't wanna blame one administration over another, because this is just the way administrations work and operate, is that there was no, or at least from where I sat, well, let me back up. Well, yeah, where I sat, there was no real sort of engagement of Republicans on the Hill. I didn't see people going up to the Hill to Jim Inhofe and Mitch McConnell, people who had all voted for the Byrd-Hagel Amendment, and saying, look, guess what? We've heard you. We admit that Kyoto was wrong. We're following your instructions, and here's what we have. I didn't see any of that, right? Instead, what I saw was, oh, this is, Paris Agreement's best thing since sliced bread. It's going to stop sea level rise. It's the answer to climate change. And I get the political messaging around that. And then the NDC announcement for the U.S. So Sue's again agreed that you make up your own target, right? You're not negotiating with anyone. But then the U.S. made a decision, and I get why they did it. A decision to announce their NDCs with China. So when they announced them with China, what happened was the people on the Hill, the Republicans on the Hill in downtown D.C. looked at them and was like, oh, they negotiated their NDC with China, and look how bad our NDC is compared to the deal that China got. That's how they viewed everything. And so I think it was a really bad political mistake domestically. I'm not passing judgment on the international piece, because I think it had merit to do it that way internationally to get Paris across the finish line. But it was a mistake domestically, and what happened was that you have all these climate skeptic groups at the time, who we can talk about sort of the origination of all that, but again, kind of a hangover from the Kyoto debate, that then stepped in and created this false narrative about what the Paris Agreement was. Total made stuff up, right? But it became it's one of these things where, sometimes reality doesn't matter, right? It's the perceived facts that matter. And Republicans were convinced that this was, the Paris Agreement undermined U.S. interests, circumvented the Senate, didn't understand it. So when I was essentially hired to help keep the United States in the Paris Agreement and to help convince the president to stay. And one of my first steps was I brought in all this industry that would have been sort of regulated in order to meet, regulated, you know what I mean, but that would have faced compliance issues when it came to reaching or meeting the US NDC. And none of them understood the Paris Agreement. None of them did. And that was kind of the landscape that we had. And so it was very, very hard to kind of unwind that and to walk into a meeting in the White House and say, no, you guys have it all wrong, this isn't correct. They didn't understand it.
And all this sort of look back at the Paris Agreement is incredibly important going forward, because it's the 10-year anniversary of the Paris Agreement being signed, and the rubber is trying to hit the road, but it's obviously proving difficult. I want to look forward with this back history, and go back to you, Hina, and ask you a question that I think came up in Sue's opening comments. What are the risks of other countries stepping out of climate diplomacy and the Paris Agreement specifically this time around? And I want to hear from everybody on this, but I think we've already seen some rumblings of Indonesia saying maybe we don't need to comply with the Paris Agreement. How is that something you've heard from colleagues, particularly in lower income countries that have more criticism?
No, I mean, I have to be honest, no, I haven't really heard that so much, but the rule setting role that the United States typically tends to play, once you open the door of people happily coming in and out, I think you in some ways set a precedent that others feel obliged to follow. But I tend to believe that the world is cumulatively or collectively at a slightly different place than the United States, and I find it very difficult when I'm told that, that they didn't get it. Meaning it's just like there's evidence out there, right? And I think the Paris Climate Agreement is actually, from when everybody feels that they are worse off, then you're doing something right? Meaning the developing world is not very happy about the Paris Agreement at all, because they think that all of the responsibility has been given to the developing world. And let's accept the fact that, look, there has to be an element of fairness in negotiations, right? So when you go to the developing world and say that it was perfectly fine when we developed on the basis of cheap coal and the basis of hydrocarbons and all of that, and now that we've developed, there will be no you cannot use your own internal resources on that. It doesn't seem fair. But all that aside, I think if Paris Agreement, from where I look at it, and as a country which has led the G77 many times, it is generally considered to be unfair to the developing world. Unfair in a way that was not committing much from the external, from the developed world to them. So it wasn't really committed on anything. So it's really odd to now be in a moment where this precedent is being set, not for once, but the second time around, that will, I think, eventually create a space for everyone to basically be able to do anything. So it's actually taking us away from the rule-based system. But I also want to say that I don't think the world will be waiting for long with a bated breath as to what is going to be the next move of the United States of America. I think Europe is very clear, and I see a general inclination. They take climate quite seriously. Developing countries such as mine also take climate very, very seriously, because we don't think we can afford to be deniers. We just have to live in the reality. So I would imagine, if I were in the United States shoes right now, I would be very concerned about losing leadership role on common goods, which defines you as a leader, as a global leader, and which gives you that superpower. So it's almost like the United States is trying to move away from everything which gives it the power, the authority, the credibility, and the more, for other people to look at it as the leader. So it's almost like somebody has a really good place and they themselves are very keen that they want to give that away to anyone else. China will absolutely, and I just want to end, I know I've gone on for a long time, but I just want to end by saying that I think it was very, very impressive to me to look at John Kerry do diplomacy on behalf of the United States of America in recognizing, because he was smart enough or realistic enough to recognize that if a country like China was not part of the negotiations, then, and what China has given to the world in terms of cheap solar panels, in terms of EV, etc., if we were living in a world which was 20 years back, we would be celebrating it right now, because it has made solar power accessible to the villages in Pakistan, India, everywhere. It has made electric vehicles far cheaper than before. But now we're living in a world where we cannot celebrate anything as a common good. We are in a decoupling moment, in a de-risking moment, in dividing the world into two camps, and that to me is a threat more than anything else to climate.
What do you think about China emerging into that void that the US is leaving? Do you think that's ultimately good for climate change?
So China in my view, 100% is already emerging as the protector of the multilateral sort of Cipher, as the protector of the common goods. I said something in the very beginning, I'm going to say that again. China's diplomacy does not believe in inspiring and paining at the same time. So they do not believe in the pain bit of the diplomacy, so their ability to get everybody to coalesce, to go around. And of course there is obviously the China fissure with Europe also, and China is viewed very differently within Europe than it is, than the United States of America. So the ability, I will keep myself to the thing that I said right at the beginning. I think the vacuum that is left by the United States of America is not fillable very quickly, and anytime soon.
In just a few minutes, we're going to throw it out to questions in the audience. So please be thinking of things you would like to ask our panelists. Sue, I want to come back to you and get your reaction to what Hina has said. And what do you think about China filling that void?
Well, I'm of very mixed minds about it. From a climate and saving the earth point of view, I would welcome it. From a, having represented the United States for a million years, and from a kind of US citizen point of view, it really pains me to think that we've ceded that role to China. And it reminds me that, I just don't understand how this administration could come in as very sort of hawkish on China and then immediately hand over the gift of pulling out not only of the Paris Agreement, but pulling out of so many other things. Having said all of that, whether they actually will emerge as a leader, I think is very unclear. I think during Trump 1, it was easy to be considered a leader because all you had to do was not pull out of the Paris Agreement. And, I think a lot of people applauded China for not following the US lead, even though they weren't doing that much to actually sort of reduce emissions. This time I don't think that works because the crisis is worse. We're more off track. They're about the 30% emitter, and I don't think they can just not be the United States and be a leader. And I think a lot will depend on the kind of the content of the NDC that they submit later this year, and that will almost be a kind of a litmus test. And as I said a couple minutes ago, I think, it's easy to say nice things about multilateralism and the rule-based system. It's ironic that we're now in a situation where they're the ones upholding, or making statements about the rules-based order and all of that. But I think if they come in with a really lowball commitment under the Paris Agreement, it doesn't really matter what you say about multilateralism and the Paris Agreement. I don't think you can be a leader at this point with too low of a commitment.
So we've talked about the NDCs, the National Determined Contributions, which will be a big part of the COP conversations later this year in Belém. So I want that to be my last question before we hand it out to you in the audience. What's at stake with this COP in Belém, and what would be a decent outcome for climate change in general at a time like this in the world? Maybe Dave, we'll go to you first.
Oh, I'm not the expert at the COP here. I would defer to my colleagues here.
You all will get a chance to talk. So
What do I think the outcome?
yeah, what would be a successful outcome for this COP?
I mean, they'll spin it so that it is packaged as a successful outcome.
Who's they? The organizers?
Well, I just think the international community they have to, right? Especially when you're seeing the sort of the antagonism expressed by the Trump administration. And I agree. I mean, look, if the Trump administration does show up at the COP, I don't think they will as of now, but if they change their mind and decide to, it's going to be to drop in and throw some grenades.
Even more than you did that wanted.
Yes, but I have my reasons to do that, which is another conversation, right?
Yeah, maybe somebody can ask that, or you can ask it after, after.
But they will not have those hidden motives when they drop in, right? So I think that for the international community, it has to be a success regardless, right? Because I think there will be, and you already see this, right, this sort of this growing skepticism. Has the UNFCCC played it out, right? Are we in this place today where we reached a point where things are so difficult that it's going to be about plurilateral agreements, bilateral agreements? Is that where it is? I mean, you see this up in UN Climate Week, sort of that expression. And so, but yeah, I mean, I think that it will be packaged as a success.
Hina and Sue, any quick comments on Bella?
Because I'm generally very skeptical of just large funfair events happening, etc., but I genuinely feel that there's value in the COPs, even though you try and get wins. I don't think the wins in climate change are annual wins, so I don't look at one COP to the other as what is the win in one COP. I look at it as a journey and how far we've gotten. And I also just want to say that I think what has been broken in some ways, and I don't want to call it broken because I think climate diplomacy had worked also very well if you look at the bigger picture. But what has actually broken some of or kept us away from achieving the absolute necessary, completely logical stuff is countries' earnest desire or commitment to stay with their stated positions rather than the reality on the ground. So the Loss and Damage Fund was a very good example of that. The developed world had a position on it, and everyone decided to just stick to their position, negotiate around it, until it took the floods of 2022 to really try and make a case. So I'm not very fond of funfair type of events, but feel there's value in COPs, but also feel very strongly that it must not be measured in annual success, but in the journey and the road that we're at.
Sue?
Yeah, I think it's an unusual COP because the main event this year is the handing in of the NDCs, which are not a COP thing because they're not negotiated and they were actually due like 2 months ago, although most countries are late. But I still think that Brazil and its COP will be judged based on whether the NDCs sort of add up to something. They're not going to add up to like keeping 1.5 alive, but they have to be within the ballpark. And that largely depends on whether China puts in the right kind of NDC. And I don't think any amount of like side initiatives will compensate for a kind of lousy set of NDCs. Having said all of that, I don't think the NDCs will be enough. I think given where the Trump administration is, you're going to also need some kind of decision coming out of the parties, kind of symbolically upholding Paris and the multilateral process and all of that, particularly given that it's the 10-year anniversary and all of that. There's nothing really much on the agenda for decision. There are some kind of arcane adaptation-related issues that most people can't even explain to you. But so I think the parties will have to go out of their way to concoct some kind of outcome that makes it look like, not makes it look, but demonstrates that Paris is kind of alive and well.
Let's throw it out to the audience. I think we might have some mic runners. Yep, I see. And so please introduce yourself and keep your question in the form of a question so we can pack in as many as possible. I see a couple hands up.
Hi, I'm Dave Kniff. I'm one of the alumni. Just a real brief question. Is there any good news?
It wasn't as rainy today as it was forecasted. If there's any good news, yes, you're supposed to
I
answer.
think there's some good news inside the United States. At the subnational level, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. It was really important during Trump 1, and it's even more important now that 25 of our 50 states are part of an alliance that is committed to Paris and also to the NDC that we put in at kind of the last minute with respect to 2035. They've already been very vocal about wanting to stick to that being engaging in international cooperation, showing up at the COP and all that. I think that's important for our diplomacy to show that the US is not, a monolith where the federal government's withdrawal from the agreement means that the entire United States is not participating. Now, the one wrinkle, to add some bad news to the good news, the one wrinkle is the executive order that came out, a week or two ago saying that the Attorney General was going to go after the states and try to get them to do less with respect to climate action. I mean, hopefully they will not prevail, and the subnationals will be able to carry out at least some measure of the U.S. commitment.
I got some good news. Sue may not like this. I got some good news though. At least right now they're just staying out of it, right?
Staying out of what?
Just staying out of the conversation. They're avoiding it. They don't want to be part of it. That's good.
You think that's intentional,
From
or
your
are they just
perspective.
focused on other things?
I think they don't care about it. They're focused on other things. But if they really wanted to be difficult, they would show up and have an NDC with a growth target. Right? But they haven't thought through any of that, and I don't think they
Well,
will.
hopefully nobody gives them that idea.
No, again, there are no Trump people going to be listening to this, and we're fine.
Okay. So I think a very, very good news is that renewables have become so accessible and cheap in so many different ways. I mean, whether you call it, you look at electric vehicles or renewable energy, and that there is largely, amongst the conversations that I have within the developing world, leaders who are very, very committed to adaptation goals and have internalized it. So if the financing gap can actually be solved, to be fixed in some ways, we are now in a position where if we will it to happen, it can happen. We have the resources in terms of the technology to make it happen, and that technology has been made very, very accessible. That's what I think.
I think there's a question up here near the front.
Thank you very much for this great conversation. I'm Thomas. I'm a graduate student at the Econ department, and I'm working on climate policy and climate agreement. I was hearing you talking about throwing grenades, and I don't exactly know all the backstories behind this. But I was wondering if having this kind of confrontational tone and kind of aggressive tone on trade policy could be actually one of the instruments that could potentially help for the climate policy as well, because I know the European Union has been developing this agenda for carbon border adjustment mechanism, and that's kind of something that would constrain other countries to reduce their own emissions. And I was wondering if maybe not the US, but some other countries could get together and have this kind of strong stance using trade tariff or financial instruments to potentially force other countries to reduce emissions.
No, that's great, Dave. You worked on that a lot, so.
Yeah, you must be a plant. But yeah, so that is, so I will say this. So the Trump trade team is very interested in sort of exploring this concept of pursuing action against countries that use lax environmental standards, enforcement, and compliance to create an artificial advantage in trade. Lots of interest with Secretary Lutnick, Bessent, Jameson Greer. They're all very interested in this. And now your question is, does that result in a potential sort of carbon-related trade policy? I think that if they were here right now, they would say, oh, well, we're talking about the environment. But I think that there will be interest in it if they pursue the policy. They're so busy now with 50,000 things related to trade that they may not get to it. But there's no question that they have an interest in exploring this, and that, and in my opinion, President Trump would support something like that. Now, I don't think that's a carbon club. I think that's unilateral. But there's a potential, though, for it to lay the foundation for cooperation. Good question.
I think we have time for one more question. Oh, I see a gentleman in the back. Behind you.
Thank you, leaders. Thank you for a great evening and infusing us with a lot of informative knowledge about what's happening currently in the US market and the government. My name is Abhinas. I'm a student, sustainability student at IIT Chicago. And the reason I'm here is I am enthusiastic about climate and sustainability. Doesn't matter if it's a developing or developed country. And my question is, as you people, current climate leaders, what few things do you suggest us as future climate leaders to take actions in the root level to bring the world into a single global community?
That's great. So what are things that more individual people can do to create change at a global level? Maybe Hina or Sue, if you want to take them.
I would happily take that question. I think adaptation is something that cannot be global. Adaptation goals can be global, but adaptation really is very, very local. And the moment you try to cut copy-paste on adaptation, it will flunk, it will not work, right? So anyone who is keen on anything like that, climate is actually, climate change and the things that you need to do around it can be very, very localized, and every literally area has its own solution. So adaptation is an area where you need localized leadership to be able to come with solutions which are relevant to that particular area. So I would highly recommend that.
In our final few moments together, I want to do a concluding rapid fire lightning round. I know how much my panelists love this game. So the first one is, would you rather negotiate with lawyers, economists, politicians, or your family members? And this is negotiate on climate change. So those are your four choices: lawyers, economists, politicians, or your family members.
Negotiate, right?
Negotiate on climate change.
Lawyers.
Okay?
Politicians, you can fool them easily.
Well, of course, I'm going to say lawyers.
What is your climate diplomacy spirit animal? I'm going to give you about 15 seconds to think about this. Some ideas: you could be a tortoise, you're slow but steady; an owl, wise but quiet; or a fox, clever and strategic. But don't limit yourself to those. Any animal. Silence is good, by the way. It breeds anticipation. I'm going to assign animals if you guys don't pick them. And Dave, I'm going to start with you.
Ferret.
Okay? We can get the whys afterwards over wine. Hina?
Okay, so the animal I want to be my climate diplomacy animal is a horse. Powerful, agile, ability, beautiful, able to do everything. But the animal that is actually climate diplomacy right now is the hippopotamus.
That sounds about right. Same for like exercising as well. I feel like that's probably how a lot of us feel. Sue, your climate diplomacy animal?
I mean, I'm told that I'm pretty aggressive and ferocious, but also fair. So I don't know which animal that would be.
Any audience ideas?
Lion.
Lion. I like it. Oh, what was that?
Dolphin.
Dolphin. They're very smart and so smart. So,
They're not ferocious though.
whale. Ooh, I like whale as well. Okay, well. Bald eagle, that's good. Okay, well, those are some really good options. Final lightning round question. So, would you rather change the past or see the future?
Change the past.
See the future.
Is this a trick question?
There's no wrong answer.
I'm probably with Dave, change the past in order to change the future.
Yes. You automatically change the future if you change the past.
Thank you to our panelists, and we'll hand it over to Michael for some concluding comments.
Well, I thought that was gonna be stupendous, and I grossly underestimated it. So, please join me in thanking Hina, Sue, David, and Amy for a spectacular, informative, educational conversation.